Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. My name is Frater Puck, and I am very pleased to have this opportunity to speak with the Speech in the Silence podcast audience. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm here to talk a bit about a class I gave. This class was called I.A.O, O.A.I, the Upright and the Averse, and the class ended up being about 5 hours long, and obviously this will be a bit shorter. So it's kind of a brief intimation of what we covered. So this isn't comprehensive. Obviously, you could spend months studying this stuff, but just a few of the essential points that we were covering and why it might be important. Just as an aside, I have just completed an interview on a podcast that I host with J. Daniel Gunther. It was a second part to an interview I did with him on his book, Initiation in the Aeon of the Child. And he had made mention of the Averse, or backwards, formula involved in the A.A. system, as opposed to the normal life cycle of what we expect a human to have: birth, life, and then death, and then life after death. The formula actually in the A.A. system is the reverse, where you go from death to life to back to being a babe in the egg, and then back into the womb, and the great return. And I had asked him the question about the Averse pentagrams and reguli, the mention of the Mysteries Averse in Libra 65, Libra Zadi, and the mention of adepts' heads above the heavens and their feet below the hells, and achieving both weddings of both the upright and the Averse, essentially. And the idea was we're balanced in this aeon. In previous aeons, things have gone so far in a certain direction that to have a perfect balance requires the Averse as well as the upright. And people tend to notice the Averse in Thelemic magic so much because rather than seeing that it's a balance, they're reacting to something they're not used to seeing because it's been hidden or underplayed or avoided, actually. And our system is simply trying to have that balance, which brings me to my class. The idea of this formula is not so easily pigeonholed. A good place to begin in this study of the formula of I.A.O. is Magic in Theory and Practice, and the 5th chapter is on that formula. I quote, "This formula is the principal and most characteristic formula of Osiris, of the redemption of mankind. I is Isis, nature ruined by A, Apophis the destroyer, and restored to life by the Redeemer Osiris." I think it's interesting to see that Crowley gives what seems like a simple definition, but then in the very next sentence starts hinting at just how not simple this formula is, and how its application is seemingly almost infinitely adjustable to any number of things. And I quote again, "There is quite a different formula in which I is the father, O the mother, A the child, and yet another in which I.A.O. are all fathers of different kinds balanced by H, 3 mothers, to complete the universe. In a third, the true formula of the B666, I and O are the opposites which form the field for the operation of A. But this is a higher matter unsuited for this elementary handbook. See, however, Liber Shamak, Point 2, Section J." Of course, in the new aeon, this might seem like a strikingly odd formula to be so central to so many rituals of a Thelemic nature. If you look at the Gnostic Mass, there's I.A.O. If you look at any of the Thelemic pentagram or hexagram rituals, the formula is evidenced there too. So what's all this business about a Redeemer? If the new aeon is leaving behind such concepts of needing to be redeemed by a Messiah of sorts, then what's the point of this formula? And Crowley addresses this. "The doctrine of resurrection, as vulgarly understood, is false and absurd. It is not even scriptural. St. Paul does not identify the glorified body which rises with the mortal body which dies. On the contrary, he repeatedly insists on the distinction. The same is true of a magical ceremony. The magician who is destroyed by absorption in the Godhead is really destroyed. The miserable mortal automaton remains in the circle. It is of no more consequence to him than the dust of the floor. But before entering into the details of I.A.O. as a magic formula, it should be remarked that it is essentially the formula of yoga or meditation. Continuing to quote Crowley, "In beginning a meditation practice, there is always, if not, one is not working properly, a quiet pleasure, a gentle natural growth. One takes a lively interest in the work. It seems easy. One is quite pleased to have started. This stage represents Isis. Sooner or later it is succeeded by depression, the dark night of the soul, and infinite weariness and detestation of the work. The simplest and easiest acts become almost impossible to perform. Such impotence fills the mind with apprehension and despair. The intensity of this loathing can hardly be understood by any person who has not experienced it. This is the period of Apophis. It is followed by the arising not of Isis but of Osiris. The ancient condition is not restored, but a new and superior condition is created, a condition only rendered possible by the process of death. The alchemists themselves taught this same truth. The first matter of the work was base and primitive, though natural. After passing through various stages, the black dragon appeared, but from this arose the pure and perfect gold." As this formula is essentially a theurgic formula, it's useful then to consider Energized Enthusiasm, an essay that Crowley wrote called A Note on Theurgy, Energized Enthusiasm. And I will just read a little bit from it. I.A.O., the supreme one of the Gnostics, the true God, is the Lord of this work. Let us therefore invoke him by that name which the companions of the Royal Ark blaspheme to aid us in the essay, to declare the means which he has bestowed upon us. The divine consciousness, which is reflected and refracted in the works of genius, feeds upon a certain secretion, as I believe. This secretion is analogous to semen, but not identical with it. There are but few men and fewer women, those women being invariably androgyne, who possess it in any time and any quantity. Now, what he's getting at has to do with what the purpose of all of this is, which is the attainment of genius, and that's with a capital G. And that's essentially the theurgic process one is engaging in. The bringing down of Godhead, the attainment of genius, however you want to describe it. It's that invocation to achieve that is this process. We go a little bit into the essay. He describes a bit about the Greek method, and I'm quoting again. The Greeks say there are 3 methods of discharging the Leyden jar of genius. These 3 methods they assign to 3 gods. These 3 gods are Dionysus, Apollo, Aphrodite. In English, wine, women, and song. And if I digress from Crowley's quote here, in today's world, I guess we'd say sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But it's essentially using these methods in a process, a refined process, to achieve this Godhead. Crowley goes further to describe how perhaps in a more vulgar age that we live in now, and being in barbarous countries, a lot of what is described as blasphemous or indecent in a refined setting of the pursuit of genius and Godhead is a holy thing, a sacrament, sacred, not profane. And I would venture to say that the profanation of these things has to do with not being refined in using them. I think it's interesting to see that in the world there's much given to distract oneself from anything serious by these very methods. Interestingly enough, one can be distracted with sex, drugs, or music, or entertainments. In many ways can be used as a means to placate people from perhaps lives that they're not that excited to live. And yet I think that's exactly the sad thing about this, is that these methods used in a refined manner to achieve Godhead is the whole point of existence, and that rather than these things being co-opted and used by society to distract you from who you are, they could be used to refine who you are. And these are methods that there's a reason why these impulses exist. You know, it's easy to want to demonize someone who seems fixated on these things: wine, women, and song, or wine, men, and song, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But I think those impulses are actually holy impulses. It's the process of how one uses these technologies that is not taken seriously and is not refined. And if one were to properly harness these things, they are sacred. And that's why we have the impulse, because it's in us to want to pursue them. But how does one learn the right way to pursue them? I'll quote Crowley again from Energized Enthusiasm. The sexual act being then a sacrament, it remains to consider in what respects the limits the employment of the organs. First, it is obviously legitimate to employ them for their natural physical purpose, but if it be allowable to use them ceremonially for a religious purpose, we shall find the act hedged about with many restrictions. For in this case, the organs become holy. It matters little to mere propagation that men should be vicious. The most debauched roe might almost certainly would beget more healthy children than a semi-sexed prude. So the so-called moral restraints are not based on reason, thus they are neglected, but admit its religious function, and one may at once lay down that the act must not be profaned. It must not be undertaken lightly and foolishly without excuse. It may be undertaken for the direct object of continuing the race. It may be undertaken in obedience to real passion, for passion, as the name implies, is rather inspired by a force of divine strength and beauty, without the will of the individual, often even against it. It is the casual or habitual, what Christ called idle, use or rather abuse of these forces, which constitutes their profanation. It will further be obvious that if the act in itself is to be the sacrament in a religious ceremony, this act must be accomplished solely for the love of God. Of course, this discussion in my original class goes on much longer and into much more detail, as did the first part just describing the formula of I.A.O. But we'll have to move forward here. All I can say is I recommend strongly studying this as much as one can. Your labor will be well repaid. Now I will go to Libra Aleph, which I recommend highly on studying this and just about everything else in regards to Thelema. In Libra Aleph, we find the chapter on Krishna and on Dionysus. Krishna has names and forms innumerable, and I know not his true human birth, for his formula is of the major antiquity, but his word hath spread into many lands, and we know it today as INRI, with the secret I.A.O. concealed therein. And the meaning of this word is the working of nature in her changes, that is, it is the formula of magic whereby all things reproduce and recreate themselves. Yet this extension and specialization was rather the word of Dionysus, for the true word of Krishna was Aum, importing rather a statement of the truth of nature than a practical instruction in detailed operations of magic. But Dionysus, by the word INRI, laid the foundation of all science, as we say science today in a particular sense, that is, of causing external change to change in harmony with our wills. This interaction with INRI and I.A.O. is worthy of its own series of classes. Again, Libra Aleph is a great way to dive into this, studying various rituals that employ these formulas also. However, this is very important as far as understanding I.A.O. is its relationship to INRI. Returning to Magic in Theory and Practice, we find Crowley saying this: "It will now be understood that this formula of I.A.O. is a formula of Tefereth. The magician who employs it is conscious of himself as a man liable to suffering, and anxious to transcend that state by becoming one with God. It will appear to him as the supreme ritual, as the final step, but has already been pointed out, it is but a preliminary. For the normal man today, however, it represents considerable attainment, and there is a much earlier formula whose investigation will occupy. Now, this is interesting also because, getting back to J. Daniel Gunther's book, much was talked about his stating that the supreme attainment is not LVX, but NOX. And again, we can't really go into that here, but this is where Crowley's kind of saying the same thing, because the attainment of Tiferet is quite an attainment, but in the new aeon, crossing the abyss and achieving NOX, the Night of Pan, is actually the supreme attainment. This is necessary to get there, this I.A.O, this Tiferet formula. And then Crowley also states, the Master Therion, in the 17th year of the Aeon, has reconstructed the word I.A.O to satisfy the new conditions of magic imposed by progress. The word of the law being Thelema, whose number is 93, this number should be the canon of a corresponding mass. Accordingly, he has expanded I.A.O by creating the O as an ayin, and then adding Va as prefix and affix. The full word is then Va, Yod, Aleph, Ayin, Va, whose number is 93. We may analyze this word in detail and demonstrate that it is a proper hieroglyph of the ritual of self-initiation in this Aeon of Horus, which Crowley does in great detail. This is a fascinating deconstruction in magic and theory and practice, which of course we don't have time to go into, but is worthy of many, many classes as well, and I highly recommend studying it. Now, I may be allowed to open up another can of worms that I can't finish discussing. Back in terms of the description of I.A.O and the HHH relationship, where the I, A, and O are all fathers to mothers, which are the H's, HHH, it would be good to look at Libra HHH. Which gives 3 methods of meditation, and when you think of it in terms of I.A.O and the fabled Libra I.A.O being the active method to use this formula, Libra 17, that depending on where you look is either said not to exist or is one of the few texts that has remained secret and no one can get their hands on. I could spend a few hours theorizing on that. I do think it would be interesting to consider that perhaps Crowley, in suggesting that there was a Libra 17, I.A.O, an active form of this energized enthusiasm, by not letting the book ever be seen or exist, it forces all of us to actually, instead of reading a text on it, actively pursue it. But that could just be a romantic notion on my part. Energized enthusiasm certainly gives you plenty of indication of how to employ this 3-part formula in an active way. That being said, I.A.O would be the fiery fathers that balance out the watery mothers of HHH, which brings us back to Libra HHH, and seeing this text as a means to balance out the active I.A.O with a meditative state that's threefold as well, the HHH. I recommend that as you explore I.A.O, you take a look at HHH and try those processes and see if that creates a nice balance between the active work you're doing. This balancing out of I.A.O and HHH brings us back to what I started discussing at the beginning of this recording, J. Daniel Gunther's explanation that the Averse and the upright together creates this balance that we're striving for. And balancing out I.A.O with HHH balances that fiery, active, energized enthusiasm with a watery meditation of the same process. So in a vain attempt to try to tie this all together into some kind of cohesion, I would wrap up this recording with a discussion on Libra Stella Rube, which is a secret ritual of Apep, the heart of I.A.O. O.A.I, delivered unto VVVVV for his use in a certain matter of Libra Legis, and written down under the figure 66. Now, again, this is a text that could be studied with a series of classes, so we're going to cherry pick the things that are relevant to our discussion. However, I think one can see just from the manner in which it's written that there's much that can be misunderstood in this text. I would venture to suggest to the reader that when things look like a sacrifice of a bloody nature, it's probably best to read this as a sexual sacrifice. And there's metaphors aplenty here. But let's start with the fact that this text refers to the infernal adorations of O.A.I, or O.A.I, which is the reverse of I.A.O. And here again we have this averse idea in a text, a holy text, describing both paths. And again, this is the reconciliation of these two things, this balancing out of opposites. Now consider this. I.A.O. was described as Theurgic, a process of bringing genius or godhead to the invoker. The note that Crowley gives in regards to Libra Stella Rube from his autohagiography is the Book of the Ruby Star describes an extremely powerful ritual of practical magic, how to arouse the magical force within the operator, and how to use it to create whatever may be required. Thus, to me, this seems to be describing thaumaturgy, that is, causing change outside yourself. And if you think of the formula of I.A.O. as bringing in a godhead form of energy, O.A.I, O.A.I, would be the reverse of that. I would suggest that this book is describing methods of achieving the Averse mystery spoken of in Libra 65. And then I'll quote Libra 65, the 5th verse of the 2nd chapter. I suffered the deadly embrace of the snake and of the goat. I paid the infernal homage to the shame of Chem. It's also interesting to note the general solar phallic aspect of I.A.O. and how in this text we get the lunar language, which balances out the sun. So you have I.A.O. as a solar phallic Osirian magical formula, and here we have this Sappho Calypso angel language, which is from the Vision in the Voice, describing the reverse of the formula. This text, of course, can be studied with many classes and probably forever. It is that rich in symbolism. But just as a remark, I would add, in verse 43 we get the line, I will give thee another ceremony whereby many shall rejoice. And I would suggest that when one reads Energized Enthusiasm, such a ritual is described. And again, in keeping with the idea that this is the reverse of that formula, this is O.A.I, and that Energized Enthusiasm with a group is the I.A.O. formula. When one thinks of this formula, especially in the way that it is written and the nature of sacrifice that it seems to be suggesting, it's a more private ritual than the other one described in Energized Enthusiasm. And there's probably a reason for that. And in just a final attempt to try to tie this all together in such a short amount of time, I will also quote from verse 64 with the line, and I will slay thee in my lust. The slaying of thee is an interesting thing when one considers A.to. 11, and also Libra HHH. Libra HHH has the quote, if in this hour thou shouldst die, it is not written, blessed are the dead that die in the Lord, yea, blessed are the dead that die in the Lord. A further understanding of this quote-unquote death can be understood when one thinks of the Book of Lies and its chapter on death and dying daily. This is a process of dying through orgasm. And when, again, as we said, is refined, is a process of magic. Well, I think that's about all the time I have. I hope I've given everyone a chance to consider some of these ideas and much to check out for themselves. There's a lot to study here, and enjoy. Love is the law. Love under will.